Morning, everyone. We're thankful that the House of Representatives is back open, and hopefully we can move beyond the MAGA Republican chaos, dysfunction, and extremism that has been visited upon the American people for the entirety of this Congress. Before I say anything further, let me just communicate on behalf of House Democrats how heartbroken we are by the tragic events in Maine, the killing and slaughter, once again, of innocent Americans, families broken, individuals injured, fighting for their lives. And we stand with the people of Maine and will do so in every way possible moving forward. It's also important that we stand by our law enforcement individuals, the law enforcement community, the first responders, because there is an active manhunt underway. And hopefully the murderer or the suspect will be apprehended sooner rather than later. And thereafter, we can enter into a conversation about how we try to confront the gun violence epidemic that continues to devastate community after community after community here in the United States of America. President Biden continues to show tremendous leadership, and he has requested that Congress act now on a national security supplemental funding request for Israel, Ukraine, other parts of the free world, along with humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians and others who may be in harm's way. The House needs to prepare itself to act immediately as soon as bipartisan legislation is sent over from the United States Senate. President Biden has also requested supplemental funding in terms of some of the domestic priorities for the American people, particularly as it relates to child care and support for ensuring that there's affordable broadband access all across the country, as well as making sure there's additional funding for disaster assistance and relief to be there for Americans whose lives have been devastated by extreme weather events that have afflicted us throughout this calendar year. The House should be prepared to act on these domestic spending priorities as articulated by President Biden, and we should act sooner rather than later. The time for Republican gamesmanship is over. The time for Republican partisanship is over. The time for Republican brinksmanship is over. Enough of the chaos, enough of the dysfunction, enough of the extremism. Let's come together in a bipartisan way to get back to doing the business of the American people. Questions?
Leader Jeffries. What conversations, if any, have you had with Speaker Johnson so far, and specifically about the Ukraine funding? He did not make any commitments when we pressed him on this yesterday. He said that he wants it to be conditional, that he has reservations about it. Did he give you any assurances that he supports additional funding for Ukraine?
I had a brief conversation with Speaker Johnson yesterday, but we did not talk about Ukraine funding. I do expect to have a conversation with him today at some point later on this morning or this afternoon. And I do expect that in the context of that conversation, the urgent need to support the Ukrainian people will come up. Supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do in terms of the brutal aggression being visited upon a democratic nation that is an ally of the United States of America. But support for the Ukrainian effort, which has been courageous, is also important in the broader geopolitical context and in terms of democratic values. Because all across the world, we are locked in an epic struggle between democracy and autocracy, between freedom and tyranny, and between truth and propaganda. The Ukrainian people stand on the side of democracy, freedom, and truth, Russia and Vladimir Putin stands on the side of autocracy and tyranny and propaganda. And so, no gamesmanship, no brinksmanship. There are no legitimate reservations, we believe, that House Republicans can register as it relates to America's national security interests, which clearly and unequivocally should be on the side of the Ukrainian people.
Mark, thank you. Can you talk for a minute? Obviously, yesterday during your remarks, you talked about concerns with what Speaker Johnson had said about the election and certification and issues like that here. When you take some of his very conservative issues, whether it be dealing with LGBTQ issues or something else, how do you separate that when you have this new player on the stage and you need to work with this person who has positions that you might describe as very MAGA, and people said we need to get away from that. So how does that work from your vantage point?
Well, I congratulate Speaker Johnson on his elevation, and I don't doubt his sincere commitment to the value set and the principles that he has articulated. But I strongly disagree with many of them as it relates to the type of inclusive America that should be about freedom and opportunity in every single zip code. As has been the case with other Republican leaders on the other side of the aisle, including the former speaker, I look forward to an open, an honest, a communicative, and forward-looking relationship where we'll understand that we will agree to disagree with each other, but without being personally disagreeable. However, as House Democrats have made clear from the very beginning, we're going to push back against extremism whenever necessary. Extremism as it relates to the attacks on the LGBTQ community, extremism as it relates to trying to undermine a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions, extremism as it relates to trying to end Social Security and Medicare as we know it, and we will push back against extremism as it relates to our very democracy and the efforts that have been undertaken in the past to halt the peaceful transfer of power. My remarks yesterday were not directed at any one individual. I only referenced the incoming speaker at the very end when I handed him the gavel. My remarks were directed at the entirety of the House Republican Conference. That's what we're focused on, their extremism. And at this point, Speaker Johnson and the House Republicans will have a choice. Are they going to double down on the chaos, triple down on the dysfunction, and quadruple down on their extremism? Or are they going to partner with us in a bipartisan way to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers?
New guy, same problem.
Remains to be seen. Second row.
Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced a resolution this morning to censure Congresswoman Tlaib for comments on Israel. Do you have a response to that? Do you expect that some Democrats may support that resolution?
I haven't seen the resolution, but the notion that with all of the challenges we are confronting right now, House Republicans are racing to once again lift up something that Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing tells us that their focus continues to be in the wrong place. House Democrats are going to continue to focus on issues like inflation and affordability and the cost of food and creating better paying jobs and making sure that we bring economic opportunity to every single neighborhood and town throughout America. Clearly, House Republicans continue to be driven by the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, Jim Jordan, and others. And they do not have the best interests of the American people at heart.
This government shutdown deadline, November 17th, the new speakers outlined a plan for a possible CR into January or April. I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you think the government shutdown is a risk, and do you want to see anything attached to that temporary bill, such as this supplemental?
We need to act on a supplemental spending request as soon as it gets sent over to the House from the Senate, and I expect that it will be sent over in short order and in a strongly bipartisan fashion. With respect to any continuing resolution, it's important that my House Republican colleagues take a government shutdown off the table. There is zero reason to ever shut down the government. By the way, they spent the last few weeks shutting down the House because they couldn't get out of their own GOP civil war. Hopefully that's over. But there is never a reason to shut down the government. The only reason it has occurred in the past is because my House Republican colleagues have decided that they want to try to jam their reckless right-wing ideology down the throats of the American people and have made these extreme ransom demands about what they want in exchange for not shutting down the government. We have never given in to any Republican extreme ransom demand in the context of a potential government shutdown. We never will. It's a futile effort, and it's just designed to hurt the American people and extract pain. And so hopefully, as Speaker Johnson has outlined, he's taking any government shutdown off the table. That would be a very responsible thing to do. Third row.
Mr. Leader, Congressman Bowman obviously went through the arraignment process this morning. I'm curious, there's the censure resolution that's been introduced against him. Is what he's done and admitted to in court worthy of censure in your view?
Not in my view. Stay here.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. You mentioned the supplemental and the government funding. There's some current concerns within the Democratic caucus about the Farm Bill and some of the provisions that have expired in the Farm Bill. Speaker Johnson said in a note yesterday to Republicans that December is where he's looking to pass an extension. Do you agree with that timeline? And what are your concerns about some of the expiring provisions in the Farm Bill that could affect some of the communities that you serve?
Well, we can't let any of the Farm Bill provisions expire. That will hurt everyday Americans. That will hurt our farmers. That will hurt nutrition programs that are vital all across America, including both in urban America and in rural America. But we haven't come to a decision about what that extension should potentially look like. We haven't given up on the possibility of a bipartisan farm bill moving forward now that the House is back open. However, this notion that we're going to agree as Democrats to allowing extreme MAGA Republicans to cut $50 billion from the Farm Bill is an absolute and unequivocal non-starter. It's not happening. So the Republicans can either agree to a bipartisan process or they can continue to play ideological games with the American people. That's the fundamental question that has been before the Congress from the very beginning. House Republicans can play ideological games, but we know at the end of the day, there's no circumstance where any meaningful piece of legislation is moving through the House of Representatives unless it is bipartisan. And there's no circumstance that any meaningful piece of legislation is moving through the House of Representatives that would also pass the Senate or be signed into law by President Biden unless it's bipartisanship. So let's end the games. Let's end the ideological crusade and let's actually engage in authentic efforts to find common ground between Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. So you've expressed a willingness and a hope that you can work in a bipartisan way with Speaker Johnson. He said the same. Just wondering, before his nomination to Speaker, did you have an existing relationship with him? And if you could, just characterize what that was.
Speaker Johnson and I both served on the Judiciary Committee. I found him to be an able and capable adversary from the standpoint of the authentically held positions that he would articulate, even when there was strong disagreement on our side of the aisle. But there were also opportunities where we were able to find common ground, including on criminal justice reform legislation that I was involved in putting forward along with my good friend and colleague, Doug Collins, related to the First Step Act. Mike Johnson supported that legislation in every iteration that was before the committee or the House of Representatives, and ultimately that criminal justice reform bill was signed into law. So there are opportunities. That is one example of the type of common ground that the American people want us to constantly try to achieve. Second row.
To follow up on the question about Congressman Bowman, many Republicans, when the incident initially happened, had very aggressive calls against Congressman Bowman, and some of them have still continued that. What's your response to some of those Republicans who said that this was one of the worst things to happen on Capitol Hill? And then if I could also get your thoughts on a piece of legislation that lawmakers introduced to crack down on a spike in organized retail thefts to help law enforcement crack down on that as it's happening in New York.
Yeah, I haven't had an opportunity to look at the second piece of legislation that you referenced, but I will. In terms of the first part of your question, I mean, many of these lawmakers on the other side of the aisle who had their hair on fire about what appears to have been an inadvertent action taken by Congressman Bowman, to which he is now being held accountable for within the criminal justice system, regularly defend violent individuals who overran the Capitol on January 6th as part of an effort to halt the peaceful transfer of power. And these violent individuals brutally beat and seriously injured 140 police officers on the day of the insurrection. And many of them who are having a panic attack publicly about Jamal Bowman have actually defended or refused to comment on the violent mob on January 6th. So you know what? We can't take anything that those individuals have to say seriously. They're not serious individuals. They're partisan political actors. And the American people are tired of that type of performative politics when there are real problems that we should be working together on in a bipartisan fashion to solve on behalf of hardworking American taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. As you bring up January 6th, obviously there's still a lot of concern, especially in your caucus. We saw it on the floor yesterday about lies and falsehoods regarding the 2020 election. I saw two Republicans, in fact, gesture to disagree when you said Joe Biden won the 2020 election yesterday. But Congresswoman Clark referred to Jim Jordan as an insurrectionist. And words matter here. Do you believe Jordan is an insurrectionist? Do you believe Mike Johnson is an insurrectionist?
Well, I'm not going to characterize them at this point because their record clearly speaks for itself. I've been very clear about Jim Jordan. He was a clear and present danger to our democracy and the poster child for MAGA extremism, who, by the way, came incredibly close to becoming the Speaker of the House of Representatives, including with the support of so-called moderates in New York. And so there's going to be some accountability around that situation as we move forward. In terms of Speaker Johnson, you know, I'll refrain from characterizing him with labels because that's not something that I think is constructive for me to do at this point. But his track record with respect to trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election speaks for itself.
You talk about an effort to pass these supplemental pieces of legislation that the White House is sending over. How realistic is it that you can get this passed in a relatively short period of time, given the fact that it was so difficult to prevent the government from being shut down last time, that you had such a difficult time with the debt ceiling, and one could argue the reason Kevin McCarthy isn't Speaker anymore is because he cut that bipartisan deal to avoid the government shutdown. You're now asking for hundreds of billions of dollars in two separate supplemental packages. How do you expect the new speaker, given the posture of the Republican conference, will allow something like that to happen?
It's a very simple approach to avoid visiting chaos, dysfunction, and extremism on the American people. That is for my Republican colleagues to stick to the agreement with respect to spending allocations that House Republicans themselves negotiated with President Joe Biden and then passed into law with respect to the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The problem that we are dealing with, unnecessary drama, has been brought about because within a week after the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act being passed, House Republicans broke their word and turned against a spending agreement that House Republicans themselves negotiated. And by the way, not only did House Republicans negotiate themselves that Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act, which set top-line spending numbers for the Congress to adhere to, and then immediately broke their word. Recall that it was House Republicans at the beginning of the year who said that they want to bring the spending discussion into the Oval Office with respect to avoiding a catastrophic default on our debt. So not only did House Republicans break their word, they're the ones that insisted that we negotiate top-line spending numbers to begin with. Like, you can't make this up in terms of them turning against their own agreement that they themselves insisted would be part of the discussion to avoid a catastrophic default on our debt. So this is very simple. Keep your word. Keep your word. It's the only thing that really matters in Washington, D.C. Trust. Keep your word, and we'll be able to meet the priorities of the American people and avoid a government shutdown that will be devastating on everyday Americans. Second round.
I know you just referenced the maybe lack of moderation of the moderates, but I'm curious, given that Speaker Johnson's position, some of his more right-leaning positions are on social issues. I wonder if House Democrats are discussing working with the moderates in the GOP to maybe counter some, actions that Speaker Johnson might take on social, cultural issues, LGBT issues.
Well, part of the agreement that was made in connection with the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act was that any appropriations bills would be free of partisan and poisonous political policy riders. That was an agreement that has already been reached. And what House Republicans did was not only break that agreement on the spending numbers, but they broke that agreement by flooding the appropriations bills with partisan, right-wing, ideological policy riders, designed to do things like attack the LGBTQ community, undermine efforts to promote a diverse armed services apparatus, and to strip away reproductive freedom from women in the military as part of the extreme MAGA Republican effort to march the country toward a nationwide abortion ban. None of it was necessary. It's all a waste of time because they themselves agreed that the appropriations bills should be free of ideological partisan policy riders. So all we're asking the new speaker and my Republican colleagues to do is to keep their word. Let's have a clean continuing resolution if that's necessary, and a clean year-end spending agreement that is consistent with the agreement that they themselves negotiated and voted for in May.
Following up on a couple questions regarding Representative Bowman, what's your response to him pleading guilty to the fire alarm charges this morning?
He's taken accountability for his actions, and it appears that the criminal justice system has responded in a fair and an impartial fashion. Last question? Take the last two. Okay.
Sir, there's a push among some in your party to censure Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, especially now that she's moving to censure Congresswoman Tlaib. Do you support censuring Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene?
There's a censure resolution that has previously been introduced with respect to Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I think that if the House decides that they want to go down this road in terms of censure, that probably should be right at the top of the list. Last question.
Leader Jeffries, back to the tragedy in Maine. Is there anything you believe the White House and President Biden should be doing to combat gun violence at this juncture?
Well, President Biden has been a tremendous leader in this space. He opened up, for the first time, the White House office on gun safety. We clearly have a gun violence epidemic here in the United States of America that needs to be addressed with the fierce urgency of now. In terms of what that looks like from a congressional standpoint, working with our colleagues in the Senate, with great leadership from President Biden, that remains to be seen in the next few weeks. Right now, I think our focus is on making sure that we are there for the people in Maine who've been afflicted by this tragedy, and that the suspect who was on the loose is apprehended. Thank you, everyone.